Well, first of all, we need to work at how do we create the kind of recovery that benefits people.
At 6:47 a.m. on December 3rd, Buckingham Palace released a statement so shocking that even veteran royal correspondents initially questioned its authenticity. His Majesty the King has made the decision to formally request parliamentary action regarding the titles and status of Camilla Parker Bowles. Following the discovery of serious financial irregularities and undisclosed accounts, His Majesty has determined that continuation of the Queen Consort title is no longer appropriate. Within minutes, the world understood. King Charles had discovered secret bank accounts his wife had hidden for years, and his response was to strip her of every title and privilege she'd spent 2 decades earning. The woman who'd finally won public acceptance was being cast out in the most dramatic royal financial scandal in modern history: the discovery and swift action. The statement that emerged from Buckingham Palace at 6:47 a.m. GMT was unprecedented in its directness and severity. Royal communications typically soften difficult messages with diplomatic language, but this announcement carried the weight of institutional fury barely contained by formal protocol. Following a comprehensive financial audit required under recent reforms to royal household transparency, serious irregularities have been identified in accounts associated with Camilla Parker Bowles, the statement read, notably using her pre-marriage name rather than her title. Multiple undisclosed bank accounts, some held in foreign jurisdictions, have been discovered containing funds whose origins and purposes have not been satisfactorily explained. The amounts involved are substantial, and the concealment of these accounts represents a fundamental breach of trust. The statement continued with language that made legal experts immediately recognize this wasn't just personal betrayal but potential criminal liability. His Majesty has been advised by legal counsel that continuation of the Queen Consort title under these circumstances would be inappropriate and potentially implicate the Crown in financial impropriety. Therefore, His Majesty is formally requesting that Parliament take necessary steps to remove all titles bestowed upon marriage. Effective immediately, Camilla Parker Bowles is no longer residing at Clarence House and has been asked to vacate royal properties. What made the statement extraordinary was its speed. Financial scandals typically unfold over months of investigation, legal review, and careful communication planning. But this action had been taken with such velocity that it suggested either the evidence was overwhelming or Charles's emotional response had overridden traditional palace caution. The timeline would later reveal it was both. The discovery itself had come through what should have been routine procedure. As part of parliamentary reforms requiring greater financial transparency from the royal household, an independent audit firm had been conducting comprehensive reviews of all financial arrangements involving senior royals. The audit, which began in September 2025, was designed to ensure compliance with new standards and identify any irregularities requiring correction. When auditors examining accounts associated with the Queen Consort's office discovered payments to offshore entities that weren't properly documented, they'd initially assumed administrative oversight. But as they investigated further, tracing the payment chains, they discovered accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg that had been opened in Camilla's name, some dating back to the early 2000s, years before her marriage to Charles. The amounts were staggering. Initial estimates suggested the accounts contained over £8 million, accumulated over 2 decades through sources that remained unclear. Some appeared to be gifts or payments from individuals with no obvious connection to Camilla. Others seemed to be transfers from entities whose ownership was obscured through complex corporate structures. And critically, none of these accounts had been disclosed to palace officials or to Charles himself. The audit team, recognizing the severity of what they'd found, had immediately escalated to the palace's most senior financial officers. By late November, a full investigation was underway, conducted with absolute secrecy to avoid premature public disclosure. Forensic accountants traced money flows, legal experts analyzed the account structures, and palace officials tried to understand how such substantial undisclosed assets could have existed without anyone's knowledge. King Charles was informed on November 28th during what those present described as one of the most difficult briefings of his reign. Senior advisors had presented him with documentation showing the accounts, the amounts, the timeline of their creation, and the mysterious sources of funding. Charles's initial reaction was disbelief. insisting there must be innocent explanations, administrative errors, or misunderstandings. But as he reviewed the evidence, the reality became unavoidable. Camilla had hidden substantial wealth for years, and the concealment itself suggested consciousness of wrongdoing. The confrontation between Charles and Camilla took place the same evening at Clarence House, away from staff and observers. Those who saw Charles afterward described him as devastated, aged by years in a single day, moving through shock towards something harder and colder. The details of what was said remained private, but the outcome was immediate. Camilla was given 48 hours to vacate Clarence House. Her access to royal accounts was suspended, and Charles informed senior advisors he wanted her titles removed through whatever legal mechanism was fastest. The speed of Charles's response shocked even those closest to him. Princess Anne, briefed on the situation, had counseled caution, suggesting they needed more time to understand the full scope before taking irreversible action. William, informed at Kensington Palace, had urged his father to consider the optics of moving too quickly, the appearance of reacting emotionally rather than procedurally. But Charles was immovable. "She deceived me for years about something fundamental. I will not have the crown implicated in financial impropriety because I was too cautious to act decisively." By December 2nd, the legal mechanisms were in place. Parliamentary officials had been discreetly briefed. The Privy Council had been convened in an emergency session, and preparations had been made for a public announcement that would shock the world and fundamentally alter the trajectory of Charles's reign. The king, who'd spent his life advocating for environmental causes and architectural preservation, would now be defined by the dramatic moment he cast out his wife of nearly 20 years for financial betrayal. The statement, released at 6:47 a.m. on December 3rd, was the culmination of 5 days that transformed personal tragedy into constitutional action. And in its wake, every aspect of Camilla's life, her reputation, her security, her future, collapsed in a matter of hours. The financial web unravels. The story of how Camilla's secret accounts were discovered began months before the November revelation, with a seemingly mundane parliamentary reform that would inadvertently expose financial arrangements hidden for over 2 decades. Understanding the full scope of what was uncovered requires tracing both the timeline of discovery and the complex web of accounts, transfers, and connections that investigators pieced together. The catalyst was legislation passed in May 2025 requiring enhanced financial transparency for all senior royals receiving public funding. The reform, driven by public pressure for accountability and pushed through by a government eager to modernize royal financing, mandated independent audits of royal household accounts, full disclosure of assets held by working royals, and quarterly reporting of significant financial transactions. When the audit firm of Reynolds Partners began their comprehensive review in September, they'd started with the most senior figures, the king himself, followed by the Queen Consort's office. The Queen Consort's finances were expected to be straightforward: an allowance from the Duchy of Lancaster, some personal inherited wealth from her previous marriage's settlement, and standard household expenses properly documented through palace accounts. But auditor Sarah Mitchell noticed something odd while reviewing payment authorizations from the Queen Consort's office in October. There were monthly payments to what appeared to be a financial management firm in Luxembourg, modest amounts of around £5,000 per month that weren't properly categorized in the palace accounting system. When Mitchell requested documentation explaining these payments, the responses she received were vague, referencing estate management services without specificity. Mitchell, following standard audit protocol, requested direct communication with the Luxembourg firm. What she discovered was that the entity wasn't managing Camilla's legitimate estates at all. It was a shell company whose primary function appeared to be receiving funds from various sources and distributing them to accounts held in Camilla's name in multiple jurisdictions. The company itself was owned by another corporate entity registered in the British Virgin Islands, creating layers of obscurity that Mitchell immediately recognized as suspicious. By late October, Mitchell had briefed her senior partners, and Reynolds Partners had escalated to palace officials that they'd discovered what appeared to be a deliberate structure designed to conceal financial activity. Palace legal advisors, initially skeptical, authorized expanded investigation with absolute confidentiality. What forensic accountants uncovered over the following 3 weeks was far more extensive than anyone anticipated. The Swiss accounts were discovered first, 3 separate accounts at banks in Geneva and Zurich opened between 2003 and 2005. The accounts contained combined balances of approximately £3.2 million. Transaction histories showed regular deposits from various sources, some from British entities, others from accounts in jurisdictions that made tracing difficult. Withdrawals were minimal, suggesting the accounts were primarily for accumulation rather than spending. The Cayman Islands accounts were even more troubling. Opened in 2007, shortly after Camilla's marriage to Charles, these accounts contained over £4 million. The source of funds appeared to be primarily from UK-based transfers, but routed through intermediate accounts that obscured their origin. Most concerning was that deposits had continued regularly through 2024, meaning the concealment wasn't historical but ongoing throughout Camilla's time as Duchess of Cornwall and Queen Consort. Luxembourg held the third major cluster of accounts, discovered through tracing the shell company Mitchell had initially identified. These accounts, containing approximately £1.3 million, seemed to serve as a collection point for various smaller payments that were then distributed to the Swiss and Cayman accounts. The structure suggested sophisticated planning, not accidental accumulation of undisclosed assets. As investigators traced the sources of funds, deeply troubling patterns emerged. Some money appeared to come from wealthy individuals with connections to Andrew's social circle, including several who'd been associated with controversial figures or businesses under investigation for financial irregularities. Other deposits traced to companies operating in sectors where royal connection might provide business advantage, suggesting possible pay-for-access arrangements or influence trading. Most disturbing were connections that investigators found between some of Camilla's account activity and financial maneuvers related to Prince Andrew's attempts to manage his own financial crises. Timing of certain deposits into Camilla's accounts corresponded with periods when Andrew was known to be seeking funds to cover legal expenses or settlement costs. While no direct transfers between Andrew and Camilla could be proven, the circumstantial timing suggested possible coordination or shared financial strategies. Princess Anne was brought into the investigation in mid-November when palace officials realized the scope extended beyond simple undisclosed assets into potentially criminal territory. Anne, known for her financial prudence and institutional loyalty, was horrified by what she reviewed. "This isn't just hidden money," she told investigators. "This is a structure designed to conceal ongoing financial activity from family, from palace officials, and from authorities. That level of planning suggests consciousness of wrongdoing, not innocent oversight." Anne's involvement proved crucial in pushing for full disclosure to Charles. She'd initially been inclined toward discretion, handling the matter quietly to avoid scandal. But as the investigation revealed the extent of concealment and the troubling sources of some funds, she concluded that protecting the institution required transparency, even if it meant destroying Charles's marriage and Camilla's position. William was briefed on November 25th, 3 days before Charles would learn the full truth. The briefing was handled by Palace Legal Counsel, who walked William through the documentation, the account structures, the timeline, and the potential implications. William's immediate concern was whether his father might be implicated, whether Charles could have known about the accounts and failed to disclose them. The investigation had found no evidence Charles knew, but the question would inevitably be raised publicly. The moment Charles was informed on November 28th became the point of no return. Senior advisors had prepared a comprehensive briefing document, but Charles had stopped them partway through, unable to process the details while absorbing the fundamental betrayal. "She's been hiding millions from me for our entire marriage?" he'd asked, his voice hollow. "While I've been defending her publicly, supporting her rehabilitation, trusting her completely, she's been concealing wealth I didn't know existed." The advisors had confirmed this was accurate based on all available evidence. What followed was Charles's demand for immediate confrontation with Camilla, a meeting that would determine whether there were innocent explanations or whether the evidence of deliberate, sustained deception was as damning as it appeared. The confrontation behind closed doors. The confrontation between Charles and Camilla on the evening of November 28th took place in Charles's private study at Clarence House, a room where they'd spent countless hours together over nearly 5 decades of relationship. What occurred during those 3 hours would determine not just Camilla's fate, but Charles's entire approach to the crisis. Those who saw Charles afterward, and the few details that later emerged through legal proceedings, paint a picture of a marriage disintegrating under the weight of revelations that neither party could navigate successfully. Charles had asked for complete privacy, dismissing even his private secretary and most trusted aides. Only 2 protection officers remained within calling distance, standard security protocol that couldn't be waived even for the most personal conversations. When Camilla entered the study at 7:15 p.m., she knew something was wrong, but not the full scope of what Charles had learned. Her first indication came from his physical distance, sitting behind his desk rather than in the informal seating area where they typically talked, creating a barrier that was as much emotional as physical. Charles, according to what he later told William, had begun by laying out the financial documentation on his desk. Bank statements, account opening records, transaction histories, corporate structures, all of it printed and organized chronologically. He didn't speak initially, just gestured for Camilla to look at what he'd discovered. The silence, he later said, was because he genuinely wanted to believe there was an explanation he hadn't considered, some innocent reason for decades of hidden accounts. Camilla's initial response was denial, not of the accounts themselves, but of any wrongdoing. She insisted these were old accounts from before their marriage, family money she'd kept separate, nothing that needed to be disclosed. But as Charles pushed, pointing to transaction dates clearly showing activity throughout their marriage and into her time as queen consort, the denials became less confident, more defensive. The turning point came when Charles confronted her with evidence of connections to individuals in Andrew's orbit, to timing that suggested coordination during Andrew's financial crises, to patterns that looked like something beyond simple private savings. "What were you involved in?" Charles had asked, his voice controlled but barely. "Because this doesn't look like savings. This looks like money laundering or receiving payments for influence or something equally damaging." It was then, according to Charles's later account to advisors, that Camilla's composure cracked. She insisted she'd been protecting the family, that Andrew had come to her years ago, desperate for help navigating financial troubles, that she'd been trying to help without involving Charles in situations that would have forced him to choose between brother and propriety. The accounts had been Andrew's idea, she claimed, ways to receive and hold funds without direct connection to him, laundering them through her accounts before they could be moved to pay his debts or legal expenses. If true, this made Camilla complicit in potentially illegal financial schemes to help Andrew evade accountability. If false, it was an attempt to shift blame to someone already discredited. Either way, it confirmed Charles's worst fears. The woman he'd trusted completely had been involved in financial arrangements she'd deliberately concealed, arrangements connected to the family member whose scandals had most damaged the monarchy. Charles had asked the question that mattered most to him personally. "Did you marry me with these accounts already in place, already hiding this from me?" Camilla's answer, hesitant and qualified, was effectively yes. She'd had some of the accounts before they'd married, had opened others after, but had never told him because she'd known he would have insisted they be disclosed or closed, and she'd felt obligated to help Andrew in ways Charles couldn't officially support. The justification infuriated Charles more than the concealment itself. "You made me complicit in your deception," he'd said, his voice rising for the first time. "Every time I defended you publicly, every time I supported your rehabilitation, every time I told the public to trust you, I was vouching for someone who was lying to me about fundamental aspects of her life. Do you understand what you've done to my credibility, to the institution?" Camilla had tried to argue that the amounts weren't enormous by royal standards, that no public money was involved, that she'd never used her position for personal enrichment, but only to help family. But Charles had cut through these rationalizations with devastating precision. The amount doesn't matter. The source being public funds doesn't matter. What matters is that you concealed millions in assets, potentially received money from suspicious sources, and lied to me about it for years. That's not a family matter, that's institutional liability. The conversation had deteriorated from there into recriminations and emotional outbursts that those outside could hear but not distinguish words. When Camilla emerged 3 hours later, palace staff reported she looked shattered, mascara smeared, moving unsteadily. She'd gone directly to her private apartments without speaking to anyone. Charles had called for his private secretary and legal counsel immediately. His instructions were clear and non-negotiable. I want a full legal analysis of what's required to remove her titles. I want her out of this house within 48 hours, and I want a statement prepared explaining why this action is necessary. When advisors had cautiously suggested this might be too fast, that perhaps they should investigate further before taking irreversible action, Charles had been immovable. She admitted substantial concealment of accounts connected to Andrew's problems. That's enough. I will not allow the Crown to be implicated in whatever financial schemes she was involved in. William, summoned to Clarence House past midnight, had found his father devastated but resolute. I know this looks like an emotional reaction, Charles had told him, but it's not. She's created institutional liability through deception. As king, I cannot overlook that, regardless of my personal feelings. William had agreed that action was necessary but suggested more time for proper legal process. Charles had refused. Every day she remains queen consort. While we know about this concealment, is another day of institutional dishonesty. It ends now. The unprecedented stripping of titles. The legal mechanism for removing Camilla's titles proved more complex than Charles's emotional urgency wanted to allow. Unlike private citizens who can simply divorce and be done, removing royal titles required parliamentary action, Privy Council involvement, and navigation of constitutional precedent that had rarely been tested. The palace's legal team, working through the night of November 28th and into the following day, researched historical precedents. The closest comparison was the removal of titles from German relatives during World War I, but that involved foreign royals, not a queen consort. There was also the abdication crisis of 1936, but that was voluntary abdication, not forced removal. What Charles wanted, stripping a sitting queen consort of her titles due to financial misconduct, had no direct precedent in modern royal history. The legal team determined that several steps were required. First, Charles needed to formally request Parliament take action through the Home Secretary. Second, the Privy Council would need to advise on the constitutional propriety of such action. Third, Parliament would likely need to pass specific legislation authorizing removal of the titles granted by letters patent upon Charles and Camilla's marriage. The entire process could take weeks or months under normal circumstances, but Charles was not interested in normal circumstances. He instructed his legal team to invoke emergency procedures, to make clear to parliamentary officials that time was of the essence, and to use every available mechanism to accelerate action. The king's position was that continuing Camilla's title while investigations proceeded would make the crown complicit in whatever impropriety the accounts represented. The emergency Privy Council session convened on November 30th at Buckingham Palace. Present were senior government ministers, judges, and royal advisors who formed the constitutional body that advised the crown on matters of highest importance. The meeting was unprecedented in modern times for its speed and subject matter. Palace Council presented the evidence of undisclosed accounts, the amounts involved, the troubling sources of some funds, and Camilla's admission of deliberate concealment. The legal argument was straightforward. Continuation of the Queen Consort title under these circumstances created institutional liability and undermined public trust in the monarchy's financial probity. Removal of titles was a proportionate response to serious breach of trust affecting the crown's reputation. The Privy Council's deliberation took hours, with several members expressing concern about the precedent being set and the optics of a king essentially divorcing his wife through institutional mechanisms rather than personal ones. But ultimately, the constitutional weight of the king's position prevailed. The Privy Council advised that parliamentary action to remove titles would be constitutionally proper given the circumstances presented. Simultaneous with the Privy Council session, government officials had been briefed on the situation and the king's request for emergency parliamentary action. The Prime Minister, after consultation with senior ministers and the leader of the opposition, agreed to introduce emergency legislation that would authorize removal of titles granted to Camilla upon marriage. The speed of this agreement reflected both the gravity of the evidence and the government's desire to support the monarchy through a crisis that could undermine public confidence in the institution. The legislation, drafted overnight and introduced to Parliament on December 1st, was brief and specific. It authorized removal of titles of Queen Consort Duchess of Cornwall, and all other titles and styles granted to Camilla Parker Bowles upon her marriage to the then Prince of Wales, on grounds that serious financial irregularities had been discovered that made continuation of said titles inappropriate and potentially damaging to the Crown. Parliamentary debate was limited due to the emergency nature of the legislation, but what discussion occurred revealed deep division. Some MPs argued this was appropriate accountability for someone who'd held public position while concealing substantial wealth. Others suggested it was disproportionate, that financial irregularities could be addressed without completely destroying someone's status and title. A few raised concerns about the precedent of allowing the Crown to use Parliament to essentially punish a personal betrayal. The vote, held late on December 2nd, passed with a strong majority but not overwhelming support. The legislation received royal assent immediately, with Charles signing away his wife's titles in what palace observers described as the most painful constitutional duty he'd ever performed. Charles's personal statement, released alongside the parliamentary action, was brief but devastating. It is with profound sadness that I have requested parliamentary action regarding titles held by Camilla Parker Bowles. The discovery of serious financial irregularities and substantial undisclosed accounts has made continuation of the Queen Consort title untenable. This action is taken to protect the integrity of the Crown, not as personal vindictiveness, but as necessary institutional preservation. I ask for privacy as I navigate this personally devastating but institutionally necessary decision. Camilla's response, delivered through lawyers rather than personal statement, challenged the characterization of the accounts as misconduct and reserved all legal rights to contest the removal of titles. But legally, once Parliament had acted and the King had signed, the titles were gone. Camilla Parker Bowles was no longer Queen Consort, no longer Duchess, no longer anything but a private citizen whose marriage to the King was intact in name only while effectively destroyed in every meaningful sense. The aftermath and constitutional crisis. The 72 hours following Charles's unprecedented action against Camilla revealed a nation, a family, and an institution struggling to process a scandal that combined personal betrayal with constitutional crisis in ways no previous royal drama had quite managed. The public reaction split along fault lines that revealed deep divisions in British society. Older citizens, particularly those who remembered the Diana years and Camilla's long rehabilitation, expressed complicated sympathy. Many felt Charles had acted too harshly, that financial irregularities, however serious, didn't warrant complete destruction of someone who'd finally earned public acceptance. Online forums filled with comments defending Camilla, suggesting she was being scapegoated, arguing that hidden accounts didn't justify such severe punishment. But younger demographics, particularly those focused on accountability and transparency, supported Charles's action more strongly. They viewed the hidden millions as fundamental betrayal, particularly offensive given the monarchy's use of public funding and recent pushes for financial transparency. The fact that Camilla had concealed substantial wealth while the nation faced economic hardship created anger that transcended sympathy for her personal situation. The international reaction was equally divided. American media, never quite comfortable with Camilla given the Diana narrative, framed the scandal as vindication of doubts about her character. European outlets, more familiar with royal financial scandals, treated it as serious but not unprecedented. Commonwealth nations watched nervously, concerned that instability at the heart of the monarchy could affect their own constitutional arrangements. The financial investigation, rather than concluding with Camilla's title removal, intensified. Once the story became public, additional information began emerging from people who'd had dealings with the offshore accounts. Several British businessmen came forward admitting they'd made payments to entities connected to Camilla's accounts, payments they described as charitable contributions or business consultancy fees, but which investigators suspected might have been disguised influence payments. Most troubling were revelations about the timing of certain deposits relative to royal events and decisions. Analysis showed that significant payments had arrived in Camilla's accounts within weeks of her hosting events attended by wealthy individuals, or following her advocacy for certain causes that benefited specific industries. While no direct quid pro quo could be proven, the pattern suggested at minimum the appearance of pay for access arrangements. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, Camilla's children from her first marriage mounted a vigorous public defense of their mother. In a joint statement, they insisted she'd been trying to help Prince Andrew navigate impossible financial situations, that her concealment had been motivated by desire to protect Charles from having to know about or participate in difficult family bailouts, and that she'd never used her position for personal enrichment. The defense was heartfelt but undermined by the sheer amounts involved and the sophisticated structures used to conceal the money. For King Charles personally, the aftermath was devastating in ways that transcended the public scandal. He'd spent nearly 50 years loving Camilla, had endured enormous public hostility to be with her, and had fought for her acceptance as his wife and queen. To discover that throughout their marriage she'd been concealing financial arrangements connected to his most problematic family member felt like a betrayal that went beyond financial impropriety into fundamental questions about whether he'd ever truly known his wife. Those close to Charles reported he'd aged visibly in the days following the title removal, moving through his duties with mechanical precision, but without the engagement that had always characterized his approach to kingship. He'd moved out of Clarence House himself, unable to remain in the space so connected to Camilla, taking up residence in Buckingham Palace apartments he'd previously avoided as too formal and cold. William's position was complicated by his need to support his father while managing his own expanding responsibilities as heir apparent. He'd issued a statement supporting Charles's decision as institutionally necessary, but privately he struggled with the precedent being set. If the king could strip titles from a queen consort for financial misconduct, what message did that send about royal marriages? About the permanence of positions earned through decades of service? About whether any title was truly secure? Catherine found herself thrust into a role she'd never expected to occupy quite so soon. With Camilla gone, she became the senior female royal supporting the king, taking on patronages and responsibilities she'd anticipated having more time to prepare for. Friends described her as rising to the challenge while privately concerned about the toll the scandal was taking on Charles and on the institution itself. The constitutional questions remained unresolved and troubling. Parliament had acted to remove Camilla's titles, but they'd done so at the king's request regarding his own wife. This created a precedent where the monarch could effectively use parliamentary power to punish personal betrayals by dressing them in institutional necessity. Constitutional scholars debated whether this was appropriate use of Crown Parliament cooperation or dangerous precedent that could be abused. There were also questions about what Charles had known and when. While investigations found no evidence he'd been aware of the hidden accounts before November 2025, some commentators suggested it strained credibility that Camilla had managed such extensive financial concealment for decades without any warning signs. The question of whether Charles might have willfully ignored suspicions to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths lingered uncomfortably. As December continued, the scandal showed no signs of fading. New revelations emerged regularly, each one adding details that made Camilla's actions look more calculated and Charles's response more justified, or alternatively, made the punishment seem increasingly disproportionate to the offense depending on one's perspective. What had become clear was that Charles had made a choice that defined his reign in ways he never anticipated. He'd chosen institutional preservation over personal loyalty, transparency over discretion, accountability over forgiveness. Whether history would judge that choice as strength or cruelty, wisdom or overreaction remained to be seen. But for Charles himself, sitting alone in Buckingham Palace while his wife of nearly 20 years lived in exile under a legal cloud, the personal cost of that choice was already devastatingly apparent. As the shock settled into grim fascination, the story of Charles stripping Camilla's titles revealed truths that transcended royal drama and financial scandal. What this moment illuminated was the impossible weight of being both husband and king, of loving someone while serving an institution that cannot tolerate deception. Charles had faced a choice no one should have to make: protect the woman he'd spent his life defending, or protect the crown he'd sworn to serve. He chose the institution, and that choice would haunt him regardless of whether it was right. For Camilla, the tragedy was complete. She'd spent decades rebuilding her reputation, earning public acceptance through relentless service and dignity. Whatever her motivations for hiding those accounts, whether helping Andrew or protecting Charles or serving her own interests, the revelation destroyed everything she'd built. Her rehabilitation was erased in 72 hours. The deepest lesson was about the corrosive nature of secrets in relationships. The hidden accounts weren't just money, they were lies of omission maintained for years, eroding the foundation of trust that marriage requires. When that foundation cracked, everything built upon it collapsed simultaneously. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome betrayal. Sometimes duty demands choices that break our hearts. And sometimes the price of wearing a crown is discovering that the person you trusted most had been lying about who they really were all along. Thank you for staying with this story. In the end, the saddest truth isn't that powerful people have secrets, but that those secrets inevitably surface, and when they do, they destroy not just reputations but the human connections we thought were unbreakable.